In those days, budgets were completely different because the Treasury had ruthless control of the whole process. And the budget document was printed about midnight the night before. We were changing the document at 11:30 p.m. And the last minute phone calls, are you at the printers? Can you change that 50 million to 30 million? That kind of thing.
Excited to be here at the British Library with an audience in front of us. We are, of course, also recording this, so this will go out in a day or so as part of the IFS Zooms In series. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today we're going to be talking about, surprise, surprise, the upcoming budget. But we're going to try not to just repeat everything that we've said over the last few weeks and months about the budget. We're going to try and look at a little bit more historic context. How should Rachel Reeves make it a success? It says here 117 days since Labour took office. 117 days between, or at least it will be between the election and the budget. In that time, of course, we've heard lots of big numbers, £22 billion black holes, suggestions there might actually be a £40 billion black hole. Of course, it's worth saying that before the election, we may have pointed some of this out. So we're going to think a bit about some of the challenges facing the Chancellor, what she can learn from previous budgets, and how she might be able to navigate the difficulties coming up. Now, to do that, I am, as I often am on the IFS Zooms In, joined by Helen Miller, who is Deputy Director at the IFS, but two special guests as well, who will give us a little bit more, I think, of a political and historical perspective on this. Stephen Bush, who's Associate Editor and a columnist at the Financial Times, and Lord Stewart Wood, who is a Labour peer, an Oxford academic, and a former special advisor to Gordon Brown, I think probably most importantly for the purposes of this evening. But with no further ado, we should probably start off with just looking a little bit at the context for the budget. We know that this is a difficult moment. As I said, this is not something that we were shy about talking about in the run-up to the election. We referred to it as a conspiracy of silence between the parties. And I'll come to Stephen and Stewart in a minute to ask them how they think that the Labour Party, the Labour government, is dealing with those problems. But Helen, perhaps you could start just by giving us some sense of what is the fiscal situation that the government is now facing. Is it really the most difficult situation a new government has faced in generations?
Well, at a high level, I think the kind of three things to know are that taxes are relatively high historically in the UK and due to be rising. That's in the baseline before Rachel Reeves said anything. Spending is still higher than pre-pandemic, but part of that is because we're spending more on debt interest, so not just fun stuff that we might want, or think important stuff like doctors and nurses and teachers. And obviously, I think as everyone acknowledges, at least some public services are visibly straining, right? I'm thinking here of courts or governments, prisons, there's obvious strain. But actually, despite the fact that you have taxes rising and a baseline in which spending is due to be cut, so that's what Rachel Reeves inherited, a set of plans that had spending being cut. Despite that, debt is only just about stabilising at the end of a 5-year period. So tax is high, spending coming down, debt only just about stable. Worth mentioning in passing that that debt situation is partly difficult because economic growth is so dismally poor, so we can't grow ourselves out of that debt pile where we maybe used to. And that's basically where the choice that Rachel Reeves faces comes from. She's either going to have to, and we said this well before the election, cut spending, as in the plans, raise taxes, or increase borrowing and let debt rise for longer, or do multiple of those three things. And I think at the election, the conspiracy of silence is that nobody told us which of those things they would do. I think now we're all pretty certain that she'll do at least two of the three. But that's, underlying all this is the big choice that the government faces, really a choice of the size of the state, what should the state do and how to fund it. And that's the challenge, is picking an answer to that.
Yeah, it's pretty miserable, isn't it? I mean, as you say, taxes are actually at the highest level ever. Borrowing is high, debt is high. So you'd think there'd be piles of money for public services, but quite evidently there isn't. And as you say, that's partly because we're spending such a huge amount on debt interest. I think that's actually a really important thing to say, because people often think of borrowing as a free lunch. Let's borrow and then we can have what we want. But actually, that comes back to bite you. but it's also a reflection of long-term trends in terms of increased spending on health, welfare, and now, for the first time in decades, increased spending on defence. But Stephen, as a commentator on this, you'll have seen the economy with the actuality during the election campaign, and then the gradual sort of softening us up for a really tough budget. How do you think they're doing on the politics as we move towards this budget?
So I'm going to slightly ruin the exercise by saying in some ways it's too early to say, right? In that they've successfully landed, I think, the argument that the Conservatives left a huge mess, that there is a problem in the public services. The problem at the moment is they've also successfully convinced people that they can't solve it, right? And if it turns out they can solve the problem, or if at the least make people feel like the problem is getting better by 2028, 29, then we'll look back on this period and go, oh, actually, that worked brilliantly, right? They successfully set up, they left a mess, things will be difficult, and then the delivery record takes care of their political problem. However, if we say, for argument's sake, that they will end up increasing taxes by about 40 billion and increasing spending by about 30, now it's possible that 30 billion of extra public spending means that you get that sense of improvement by 28, 29. But equally, it's possible and you don't, right? You just end up in the position that Rishi Sunak found himself in 2024. So I think it's slightly too early to say. However, not just because the historical trend is that first-term governments tend to be re-elected and first-term oppositions tend to stay that way, I do actually think that they have handled the politics fairly well once you account for the decision, which may have been right, may have been wrong, but they've done it now and they can't get out of it. The decision that both parties took to go, we think it's in our interest not to be honest about these trade-offs about tax and spend. Visibly, that was the wrong choice for Rishi Sunak, right? I just think it is implausible to argue that a hypothetical in which they went into that election with any other strategy than the one they went into could have gone worse, unless the strategy involved him going door to door and punching voters in the face. It's just really hard to see how it could have gone worse. Now, of course, the gamble that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves took before the election was it would be easier to get out of the straitjacket they had set for themselves in government, right? And once you've got the pulpit of government, you can make the argument to do things differently.
Yeah.
It obviously worked for Labour in 1997 to 2001, but they John Major was basically the world's best prime minister to have as your immediate predecessor, and Rishi Sunak wasn't.
Well, that's an interesting way. Well done, John Major. I'm sure he'll be really delighted with that particular bit of praise. Stewart, I think the three of us have sort of agreed that the prospectus that Labour had in their manifesto in terms of taxes and spending at least wasn't fully honest. Do you think we're in a world where it's inevitable that oppositions in particular just can't fess up to some of the difficult choices ahead of them? And if so, does that make it much more difficult in government than it need be?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I think it's easy to say Labour should have given a fuller account of the state of the public finances and the next 5 years. But in opposition, I'll defend them a little bit on this, I think, because I do agree that there was room for more honesty, definitely. But once Labour in opposition, imagine in the campaign, Labour had said, actually, the state of the public finances is dire for the next 6-7 years. And we're going to then we're going to give you some quantum of how bad it is. Well, the next question from Stephen and his colleagues would be, right, so what are you going to do? Right? And they'd have had to paint out in opposition without knowing anything about neither the trajectory of the next few years nor the state of public finances in that much more detail. They'd have to give policies galore, or else they'd be accused of raising an analysis without a prescription. So they made a gamble, as Stephen said. They took a gamble saying, look, it's the Conservatives' mess. The public believes it's the Conservatives' mess. I kind of believe it's the Conservatives' mess as well. We'll win that battle. And that means that once we get in, we'll have latitude to make choices which are justified by the situation. Of course, Paul Johnson's going to continue to say, I've been telling you this for 2 years, but we'll face that, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So that was a reasonable political gamble, I think, on their part. I just think the nature of the combination of tax, debt, public spending challenges clearly is there. But on top of that, you've got to factor in the extra problems Labour has in virtue of the promises they've made about the character of the policies that they'll have to meet this. So they've promised no return to austerity, and we may come on to this later, but what is austerity is an interesting question. What counts as austerity? What feels like austerity? If you're Shabana Mahmood in Ministry of Justice, it might feel completely different than if you're West Streeting. What does it feel like to you guys, to voters? So you've got that. You've got a principle that those with the largest shoulders should bear the greatest burden. And then you've got the specific tax commitments on VAT, national insurance, and income tax. And those are further constraints in the sort of parameters of how they can respond. So I mean, I'll be very surprised if it wasn't a mixture of all three things from what you said. It has to be some mixture of all three. And part of the problem of all three is that means increasing spending and cutting spending at the same time. And you're going to have different messages for things like capital spending, where you want to suggest that, of the three purposes of the budget, right, which are fixing the foundations and ending the fiscal fictions of the last few years, starting to sort out public services, by which they mean the NHS, right? They mean the NHS when they talk about public services. And then the third thing is getting growth kick-started again through an investment revolution, right? So for the third message, the investment revolution, you're going to have a more expansive fiscal position. But to make everything else possible, you're going to have austerity in pockets. And that's going to be a really difficult balancing act for them to try and convey, it seems to be, next week.
Well, that's going to leave nobody happy, because they're going to increase taxes and they're going to have some public services struggling even further. We'll see where we end up with, but that is going to be a difficult one to land, I would have thought. I mean, on the specifics, I mean, one of the most striking things in the manifesto was that no tax rises on working people, no increases in income tax, national insurance, VAT, and corporation tax. Put those together, if you take that seriously, that's 3/4 of all taxes they can't raise. We've obviously had all sorts of suggestions that national insurance doesn't really mean national insurance, it means employee national insurance, and working people are only people who are defined in very particular ways. To what extent, Stephen, do you think that there's a risk with, in a sense, you do the right economic thing? If you need to raise taxes, actually, you should break those manifesto pledges. How risky is that from a political point of view, in terms of people just losing faith in the process if they're seen to have broken those promises?
I think the slightly odd thing about those promises is, broadly speaking, people, everyone in the United Kingdom's heard of the Labour Party, and people understand that they are the party that spends more money. Broadly speaking, when people in this country vote for the Labour Party, it's because they would like them to spend more money. I think one of the dynamics of that promise is that everyone, when they hear the Labour Party say taxes won't go up, they're like, okay, but they will a bit, right? You're the Labour Party. And so I think there's this odd thing for them where there is a risk of disillusion if taxes go up and people think things haven't got better. But I think it's striking that actually the thing which caused Keir Starmer's approval ratings to drop was him explicitly doubling down on the pledge. I think history suggests that. Well, the interesting thing is that in terms of the letter of the pledge, it is obviously easier to defend fiscal drag and raising employers' necks, right? Most people, I think wrongly, but most people do think that employers' necks are different from the ones that they pay. The flip side of that is that we have pretty good evidence in 2024 that people feel the effect of fiscal drag and get grumpier about it than they do about the, essentially the Mars bar-sized tax cut than the national insurance cut represented for the average earner. So I think the bigger risk for them is then they will, they'll end up in this position where they can say with a straight face, well, we haven't broken this promise, but everyone feels like they've broken that promise. And when you consider the stuff they want to do on the labour market, if you pair that with some quite hefty rises on businesses, you are asking an awful lot of the corporate world in terms of both raising revenue, taking on greater costs of employment. And you can make a perfectly good argument for any one of those things, but I think there does need to be some balance in terms of attracting and retaining innovation, entrepreneurship, and FDI, given everything else.
Yeah. So you're sort of suggesting that there are challenges there, maybe there are contradictions between saying, we're absolutely going for growth and we're going to increase our employer national insurance contributions and we're going to increase employment regulation and we're going to increase some taxes on high earners or capital or what have you. And people will feel fine about that if in 3 or 4 years' time their wages are growing fine and their take-home pay is growing fine. But if it's not, then they're going to really start blaming the government. And the truth is, what's happening to growth in 3 or 4 years' time, it's a little bit down to the government, but there's an awful lot of luck involved. I mean, Stewart, you got quite lucky back in the 2000s, where you say,
Thank you very much.
saying that.
Is that a personal remark?
well, very, very lucky in many ways to have all that fun in the Treasury.
Yeah, right.
But that Labour government was lucky to, as Steve was saying, have John Major as the predecessor.
Yeah.
Actually, the public finances doing quite well in growth. Doing so well that some economists foolishly seem to think that it will go on forever. But I mean, if you look back in that period, I mean, it is fair to say, isn't it, that it looks like Rachel Reeves is going to have a series of considerably more difficult budgets than Gordon Brown had, certainly over his first several years.
Yeah, the Gordon Brown 1997, when he came into the Treasury, he's remembered not for the budget interest. He's remembered there for the Bank of England independence moment more than the budget. But the sort of budget moment was we've taken the tough decision to stick to the conservative spending limits in a context of secular growth, which since 1992 have been taking off since we had the ERM debacle.
Yeah.
And so he could afford to project toughness in public spending decisions, and yet money was still rolling in. And, in the first, I think he financed the $6 billion for the New Deal for jobs in the first budget. So there was still money to play with in a way that's clearly not the same for Rachel Reeves. But Rachel Reeves and Gordon Brown have one massive thing in common in their approach. Obviously, the context is very different, as you said. They're both politicians formed by the same moment, which is John Smith's shadow budget before the 1992 election. That is still, in the Labour Party I've been involved in, I've been lucky enough to be involved in Labour for 25 years or so. It is still the kind of touchstone moment for most parts of the Labour Party, apart from the left of the soft left and the Corbynite left. Because it's the thing that the Blairite and the successor to Blairite parts of the party go back to, and the Brownites, which is that Labour loses when it's not trusted on tax. That is just, it could be written on the walls of the Labour Party's offices. And Rachel Reeves, I think, has that in her DNA too. And that's why, and I think polling suggests, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen may know this better than me, but polling suggests the British public at the moment, the two things they care most about the Labour government delivering on are keeping the tax pledges and sorting out the NHS. Yeah. Those are the two things. So there is latitude either side of that. As you say, that's 75% of tax revenue, but they do have latitude to say the context demands more flexibility outside of those things, but that's where they'll be judged on. And the really interesting about this budget, I think, is I think business will probably, I think there'll be issues for business on tax side, but actually business in the first 4 months, putting all the noise about Taylor Swift and freebies aside, have been pretty happy with the priorities that the Labour government set out. I think the really interesting thing, businesses don't vote, of course, right? The National Health Service is going to be the key thing that Labour's going to have to point to in 4 years, 5 years, saying this is getting better. And that this budget has to engineer the start of that in a big way. And that's where the real current spending problem is going to come for them.
I remember that, the 1992 shadow budget. I actually was working at the IFS at the time. I did spend some time in between when I wasn't working at the IFS. And it was extraordinary. The press coverage of it was so negative. But we at the IFS did as we do, our pre-election analysis. And I remember standing up with a presentation about Labour's plans. And the first, this was a time before PowerPoint, and we had transparencies that you put on top of one of those projector things. And I'd taken a transparency of the front page of Private Eye. And it basically had a headline: Labour plans slaughter of the firstborn. which gave you some sense of the calm and rational way in which the budget was the shadow budget was covered. I mean, that was the scale of the negativity towards that shadow budget. Now, one way, Helen, that all politicians want to sort of talk about tax is to say someone else is going to pay it. There's a little saying in tax: "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree." And the way that Labour are talking about it is that those with the broadest shoulders will pay the tax, whether that's non-doms or private equity people or people who are in some way rich. Which is always defined as someone earns a bit more than I do.
Yep.
How far can they go with that as a sort of as a guiding light? And I mean, do you think they'll actually keep to it?
Well, what can they do first, I guess? I mean, if you look at the taxes they haven't locked down, there's not a great deal left. And some of what's left actually looks like politically. You could increase fuel duties, for example. That's not locked down. Are they going to do that massively? No, I doubt it. One of the things that's left that people are obviously talking about is the capital taxes. So stamp duties, capital gains tax, inheritance tax. They're a pretty small slice of overall revenue. So you've got to do really quite a lot to get any big chunky money. And I think another thing that's hard is that not only have you got to do quite a lot, they're currently all badly designed for various different reasons. So I think if you just put the rates up, you actually get quite a lot of damage along the way. So if you want to raise real money, you've really got to do proper reforms to them and put them up, which I think they could and should do. But it's not like with income tax where you put a few pennies on income tax, suddenly the billions of pounds start flowing to the Treasury. You've got to do quite a lot of work to redesign bits of tax or remove reliefs, lots of battles along the way with the individual groups that like that particular relief that you're removing. So you've got to do quite a lot of hard work to get quite a lot of money. So could they get quite a lot of money? I mean, yeah, I think they could get multiple billions from a combination of, capital taxes, but I think you'd upset a lot of people and it'd be quite a lot of hard work. Another bit of context that's worth bearing in mind is that one of the things the Conservatives did, that they don't want to tell people about very much, is that they cut direct taxes on average earners. So actually, although taxes rose, they came down, income tax and NICs came down for average earners. So actually, we've moved to a situation where we're already getting more from high earners. Now, you could get even more from high earners, but I think there is a point where it gets harder and harder to do that. So even if you're going to break a pledge, and maybe you're going to break a pledge on income tax, or you're going to find a way to deal with pension contributions, or some other way to get the broad shoulders, it just gets increasingly hard to raise a really big tax burden without touching Middle England. Middle England have actually been relatively well protected. So I think you could go further, but I think it's getting harder.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's another conspiracy of silence. So the last Conservative government really hit high earners, and they're not going to tell you that, and the Labour Party aren't going to tell you that. So, it's left to us to tell you that.
Slightly funny about all of these kind of chin-stroking things about, the realignment, how could it have happened? Why are very high earners, not voting for the Conservatives? It's just like, I mean, gee, I don't know. I mean, if you're a high earner, in your 30s or 40s in, say, Surrey, you pay a lot more tax than you did in 2010, and you get, having not asked for very much state, broadly speaking, you get very little of, you get even less, of it. I think one of the interesting things about this Parliament is we're slightly, I think, going to stress test this theory some people have that the realignment is primarily cultural, because actually, yes, some very, very rich people voted for the Labour Party for the first time in 2024, but they had been given they had been kicked pretty hard for 14 years. And I suspect we may see a slight unpicking of the realignment for precisely that reason.
Well, you were saying that they can't have voted Labour expecting to have their taxes cut. So if anything, they must have known that this is a government that's more likely to do it even to go even further. It's interesting. Well, your colleague Jalan Ganesh talked about how, in a sense, the sort of the suburbs and the rural bits kind of save London from itself by not voting for very left-wing things, which might actually be really bad for the people who do vote for those left-wing things. And who knows? Maybe that'll come home to roost.
Can I ask you about pension tax relief?
Oh, of course you can.
So, this is me asking the IFS a question. You're asking me a question. So your higher rate pension tax relief, there's a 40% rate pension tax relief on private contributions to your private pension. So I looked this up, that costs the Treasury something like 60% of the total tax relief on pension contributions, for over 60%, is given to the top 20% of the income range. So it's straightforwardly a regressive subsidy. Big money, 25, 30 billion quid a year. Now, that's working people, right? It's
Absolutely.
not a tax. It's not raising a tax. It's eliminating a tax relief. There you start to get dancing around the head of a pin, maybe. But, you might think that's a line I can... of course, a lot of those people are public sector workers, and there's all sorts of people that what's feasible, not feasible?
I thought it was hilarious. There was a headlines, was it 2 weeks ago, sort of suggesting that Labour had ruled out restricting the tax relief because suddenly they found out that this would affect a lot of public sector workers. Right. Like we didn't know that. And like private sector workers don't matter. But I think there's lots of answers to that. Yes, of course it's true that most tax relief goes to higher earners because they pay nearly all the tax. The top 1% pay 30% of income tax. The top 20%, I can't remember, they might probably pay about 80% of income tax. So, of course, any relief is going to go. It's going to go more to them. In terms of, can you move away from a higher rate relief? Well, you can, but it's really quite complicated for defined benefit schemes in the public sector, and it would hit a lot of nurses and teachers on 40 grand because actually their pension contributions are so valuable that they might not be higher rate taxpayers now, but they're only not higher rate taxpayers because they're effectively getting higher rate tax relief on their pension contributions. So it would be incredibly unpopular. I think there is also actually a principled argument for this, which is that if I'm, certainly if I'm a higher rate taxpayer in retirement, it would be unreasonable to only give me basic rate relief now, maybe pay higher rate later on. But actually, even if I'm a basic rate taxpayer in retirement, I should be able to smooth my income across time. It means I'm just not rich across my life. The fact that I'm high income in one year and low income in another, actually the tax system which gives you a chance to smooth that makes some sense. But equally, of course, this is a big number, as you say. It's going to be terribly tough.
Yeah, if you want a policy which gives you a big number, which doesn't break the pledges, I can't think of many others.
Well, I think the other alternative, actually, which I think would be much better, would be which has been suggested, is that at the moment you get you pay no national insurance contributions on employer contributions into pension schemes. Now that is a tax break worth something like 15 billion, something like that. And you pay no national insurance at all. So there's no tax as you put it in, no tax as it's accumulating, and no tax as it come out. I mean, that's ludicrously generous. And actually, there's been lots of briefing that might be something that gets changed. So I'd be surprised and disappointed actually if they kind of restricted the income tax relief, but I'd be quite pleased if they restricted the national insurance relief. Now, one of the things that's been very striking that's been where I've been in a different position to a lot of the political commentators on this budget is, as I said, it's going to be 117 days between election and budget. And lots of people have been saying, oh, God, this is terrible because we don't know what the government's doing, and that's why all these stories about glasses and suits and Taylor Swift or whatever have been circulating. If they'd only got on with it and done a budget much more quickly, we'd know what the policy was. Whereas my view is 117 days, that's no time at all to work out what on earth you're going to do with capital gains tax and national insurance contributions and the spending review and so on. So what's your view about that balance between have they gone too long? Should they have done it quicker? Actually, in my view, maybe they should have left it till the spring and really worked out what they're going to do.
I think actually looking back, I mean, they won an election in July. There's only 2 weeks of Parliament until the summer break. Then they came back and it was 2 weeks again and then conference season. It's very difficult to see. They could have done it earlier in October, perhaps. But technically, I don't see how they could have done it much earlier. That's the first thing to say. I think also they haven't been in power for 14 years. It's the first budget that Labour has ever done with the Office of Budget Responsibility process, which takes a bit longer. Plus, they have this slight problem, massive problem, of doing a mini spending review, setting up a larger spending review next year at the same time as the budget. Interesting, by the way, that a spending review alongside the budget is a sort of recent development. It's not something that normally happens. And it has lots of pros and cons if you're in the Treasury doing the two things at the same time. But anyway, so given they had to do all that, plus they had to actually get their feet under the desk and think about how they were going to do the launch of their manifesto pledges and key legislation like Great British Energy, I don't think it could have come that much earlier. I mean, I think that the problem they've had is that you lose control of the briefing because of that period. So Rachel stands up in July and says, there's pain coming your way, and then everyone goes away on holiday. And what that means is that the Telegraph, the Mail, even the FT, everyone is like, it's silly season, right? You can say, oh, are you gonna put 100% tax on having a third child, or and they say we don't comment on budget measures. Oh, and then they run for it, right? The refusal to deny, there it is. So every story under the sun has been sort of been flagged. And actually, I suspect the Treasury quite likes that now, because there are so many hairs running now that actually it's quite a good way of doing expectations management, because it can't possibly be as bad as the sum total of every Telegraph and Daily Mail story in the last 2 months.
I think there was a Telegraph headline, something along the lines of middle classes face annihilation.
There you go. That kind of and the Treasury refused to deny it because they wouldn't comment on the budget. Yeah, there you go.
Well, it's right there. You're saying that the problem is not just they left it a long time, right? It's the combination of you had an election where they set out what they weren't going to do. Then you had a summer event where they're like, actually, change your plan, guys. Lots of pain to come, but hold on, the pain's coming, other than the winter fuel stuff. And then they'd locked down so much that every journalist rang us over summer saying, well, we've got the list of what they've locked. We've got the list of what's left. The pain must be coming from here. Tell us what it's going to be. And there wasn't much that was left. So they sort of left themselves open to, obviously people are guessing that it's capital gains. Of course people are selling assets because they know it's one of the list of things that could happen. So it seems to me it's the combination of having an election where you don't say very much, then suddenly changing your tune, and having restricted your choice, your policy set quite a lot. Of course you've left yourself open, haven't you, for people selling assets and...
the trouble is we're dealing with anecdote here, but there's so much anecdote that it's all pretty much data. I mean, you talk to anyone in the financial services industry, they'll say that people are taking their pension lump sums, people are cashing in capital gains on the just on the guess that something's going to happen in the budget. I don't really know how you avoid that. I have to say it's an incredibly hard thing to avoid. But people are often saying to me at the moment though that they can't remember a time when we knew so much about what's going to be in the budget so early. But I feel rather the opposite. I mean, I kind of, I know it's going to be a big budget, but actually, I don't actually know what, I mean, sort of, if you think of some budgets recently, certainly by the Sunday before, you knew everything that was going to be in them. I really don't know what's going to be in this. I mean, I think there will be some tax rises, and there might do something with, some bits of national insurance, but I actually don't know which bits. They might do something with capital gains tax, but I actually don't know what. They're going to do something, or they make some decision on spending, but I really don't know what. I mean, Stephen, from your journalistic position, are you in the camp of, blimey, we really know loads, or are you more in my camp, which is actually, I don't know why people think they know lots, or maybe I'm just the ignorant one here?
So this is a very sensitive topic for me, because I agree, I feel I know less about this budget than anyone, but I feel I should disclose at this point that my partner is Darren Jones' special advisor. So it really is particularly embarrassing, because it's just like, it's like area journalist cannot get scoop in his own flat. But, what I think is interesting is that it feels that loads of people do believe that they know stuff about what's in the budget, but when you talk to them about it, their suggestions about what's going to be in it are just obviously not true. I mean, I was talking to someone who works in the NHS and said, oh, well, obviously we'll have less in cash terms next year. And it's just this thing was
that ain't going to happen.
I think that the Labour Party likes existing. And therefore...
Not so sure about the Conservatives at the moment.
And therefore they will want to continue to exist. So I think, the one thing we can all bet on is that there will be more money for the NHS. But the slightly strange thing about this budget isn't, I think we feel we know a lot about it because, as you were saying, right, they've ruled out so many levers in terms of revenue raisers. Well, it becomes quite obvious when you eliminate the things that you could do but would be economically disastrous, or you eliminate the things that successive chancellors have looked at and gone, actually, that's a bad idea, I'm not going to do that. You end up with a very clear idea what they're going to do on revenue. If you're the kind of cool person I am, who loves looking at that stuff, so you feel you know an awful lot. But then in terms of the more tricky question, which is, obviously the NHS is going to get more money. Obviously they are going to do something that, to Keir and Rachel's satisfaction, allows them to say, this is not a return to austerity. And I think Stuart's exactly right, and there's a fascinating historical debate that in some ways it will be actually a return to 40s style austerity in some ways, because it will be heavy tax rises, it will be a bit like some of the stuff Howe did. But we don't know what their definition of safeguarding the public services is. We've got a pretty good idea what it means both for the NHS, because the electoral imperative is what it is. I think we all assume that there'll be more money for prisons and justice because it's Keir Starmer's passion project, but then we look at the fact that one of the ministers who took the latest to settle was Shabana Mahmood, so we go like, oh, well, who knows? But I think it is actually, and maybe this is just, me making excuses for the fact that I don't know when I feel I really should. But I think it is a budget which we know much less about than almost any budget we've had for a very long time.
I'm glad you're confirming that.
Three quick things to look out for in budget. Always look out in budgets, but this one in particular. One is, Stephen's completely right about this. There are things that we know we're going to have to spend more money on. The question is when, and is now the moment they start, or is it going to be later? Defence is a big one, for example, right? Is defence going to have a tough year until the review, and then it'll start to get better? Hopefully, who knows? That's one. Second thing. First budget for a new Chancellor is a chance to set things in train that you have your eye on the prize on down the line. So it will be interesting on issues like social care, for example, whether a piece of work or a sort of Great and the Good Commission is set up, or
Another one.
I know. It could be social. It could be things like reform of council tax. If they touch that, then good luck to them. That's a poison chalice, but everyone knows it needs to be done at some point. Business rates, they said they want to look at some point. So there's all sorts of pieces of work.
Manifesto says they're going to abolish them.
Indeed. So there's all sorts of pieces of work that could come out which are sort of fruit down the line. And the third thing are ruses. The Treasury is really good at ruses. My favourite Gordon Brown ruse was moving the date. Do you remember this one? The date.
I know what you're going to say now.
North Sea oil tax revenue is collected from April to January. So it moved into the tax year right before the 2005 election. Suddenly the Treasury had billions more without actually doing anything different other than changing the accounting deadline into an earlier fiscal year. There are ruses in every budget. There are very smart people whose entire job is to come up with ruses. Paul used to be one of them in the Treasury himself. And keep an eye out for the ruse, or the IFS will keep an eye out for you.
We will. The other thing that Gordon moved, of course, was the date of the economic cycle to allow him to keep his rules.
In terms of things we know, because we can look at tax policy and work. The interesting thing about, and I think an argument for doing it in October, is that they will gain headroom purely by the device of the comprehensive spending review happening in spring. And I think that's going to be a thing which is quite rightly going to annoy all of us around this table from a good, actually having a meaningful fiscal rule perspective. But I suspect one of the other ruses will be, then this will allow them come February, and then of course come the later comprehensive spending review to be like, oh look, we've created extra money just by moving these 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem here, of course, is that is clearly not real. And actually, if you look further down the line, this is going to be another cheerful statement from us, but, things look difficult now, but they ain't going to get any easier in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. I mean, if you look at the OBR numbers, they look horrendous because we end up spending so much on pensions and health and so on that we end up with debt the size of, the size of the earth. Of course, that is because things are getting harder. If we want the current welfare state, we want more and more old people and very old people, and we spend more and more on health. And, we want to. There's no point getting richer if we're going to be dead or sick. So, we're going to want to spend more on health and social care and all those things. Push it out 1 year and sort of some budgetary sort of magic might make it look a bit easier. But the reality is that at the next election and the election after that, the IFS is probably going to go, oh, it's going to be really hard over the next 5 years because we're going to have to raise taxes. And sadly, it's going to be true because we've had this extraordinary parliament, the last parliament, where taxes, after 50 years of stability, taxes rose by about 70 or 80 billion pounds relative to GDP. Going to rise again over this parliament, probably going to rise again over the next parliament. We're just going to have to get used to a bigger state and bigger taxes.
One of the things that Gordon Brown did, but understandably didn't talk about, is he did successfully unpick an awful lot of the Thatcher era tax cuts. Right, that was an important part of them being able to afford the extra spending. Now, they did it in all sorts of ways involving fiscal drag and national insurance for the NHS, etc., etc. But one of the many ways that it's a more difficult inheritance is that because under Osborne in particular, the tax system did become more progressive, that unpicking is going to have to involve working people in some description.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting hairs will be, surely they'll want to do something, right, that allows them to make the argument for for all of us to pay more taxes, in the same way than they very skillfully from 1997 to 2001 did this kind of like, I know you think you voted for us saying we wouldn't raise taxes, but actually, wouldn't you love to give us another landslide, promising that we will in fact raise all of your taxes? Because in some ways, the thing about the candor deficit is only an incumbent government can fix the candor problem. Then ultimately, 2024, the fact we have this dishonest election was Rishi Sunak's fault. If we have another dishonest election in 28, 29, it will be Keir Starmer's fault, because it is ultimately the Prime Minister who can sit the country down and go, here are the trade-offs, here's my solution to the trade-off, what is the opposition's? And, we're kind of living with, and I think, an underrated Brexit cost, which is that we basically stopped doing anything about public services after 2014, because the government understandably did that year before the election. Let's focus on getting re-elected, which is perfectly normal. Year before the referendum, let's try and focus on the referendum, which means essentially the last time anyone went, how are we going to change how the public services operate in an ageing population, declining fuel duty, was a decade ago. So of course everything's got worse.
Sorry. I said, given all this, given how hard it is going to be, and Rachel obviously knows that in 5 years it's going to be hard, right? That's not news to anybody. I mean, could she really surprise us and do something like put up VAT? I was thinking back at where the big tax rises have come in history, and VAT is often, a place where chancellors look. And they're the big taxes that tend to stick, right? We had the big increase to 15 to 17.5 to 20. Of all things chancellors have done, VAT seems to be one of the levers they can move that don't get unwound. It would obviously be breaking a pledge, so it's not a prediction. But if you're going to break a pledge, are you better off, rather than trying to get some definition of employer NICs not being a tax on working people, which you're really straining the English language at that point. But regardless of that, why not break a pledge properly and put up...
break it. The bizarre thing, if you think of the last government, was, George Osborne increased VAT in 2010 by 2.5%, a huge tax rise. And I remember nobody squeaked. And then he suggests putting it on pasties, and the whole world goes mad. So it's kind of, it's rather actually like what Rachel Reeves did in the summer. It's what actually is a tiny cut to income for pensioners. Everyone goes absolutely nuts. Bin social care reform that they said before the election they were going to implement, they wouldn't even noticed.
That's got to be the danger here, right? She does lots of little things like tweak some capital gains tax, remove some reliefs in inheritance taxes, maybe put some employer NICs on pension contributions. You upset a lot of people. You won't have to roll back on. You ever had the Philip Hammond style, got to go U-turn your NICs change, or you have something got to get rolled back. Whereas if you just did something a bit bigger and a bit bolder, maybe actually a few percentage points of VAT would stick somehow. It does seem that bigger is easier sometimes.
I actually think that the public debate is all about tax, right, at the moment. Which tax are they going to raise? What's going to... And we also know there's been some ding-dongs between cabinet ministers and the Treasury. My guess is that those ding-dongs are probably about something completely different. What they're about is, I suspect the Treasury is saying, here's your efficiency savings target for your current spend, which you've got to recycle, some ludicrous percentage of in order to justify increases in spending. And they're looking at it going, you've got to be kidding me. That seems to be what's going on. And I suspect we are overestimating the role that tax increases will play in the budget spending review combination, and underestimating quite how much the Treasury is trying to enforce efficiency savings in baseline spend, which the Treasury always wants to do, but I suspect they're doing a lot more of it now than they have done before. And good luck, because that is a really difficult thing to do, right?
So any hints and tips from your years working with Gordon?
Get
your sleep in before the budget, usually. Gordon was, I'm sure there are different views about Gordon Brown in this room, but he was, the budgets in those days, I sound like an old man in a chair with a blanket over his legs talking about the war, but which I will be quite soon. But in those days, budgets were completely different because the Treasury had ruthless control of the whole process. And the budget document was printed about midnight the night before.
It really was.
It was delivered.
Not 3 a.m.
We were changing the document at 11:30 p.m. And the last minute phone calls, are you at the printers? Can you change that 50 million to 30 million? That kind of thing. So, and you had total control over that.
You think he's joking?
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And what that meant, we didn't have an OBR process. So the OBR process means there's 2 weeks for things to leak. Which Treasury, on the whole, is a very disciplined institution. It doesn't brief against its ministers. It's very, very, not always, but mostly it's very self-disciplined. You've got the OBR problem. And so in the old days, Gordon Brown used to have this sort of ruthless control politically as well as the Treasury's ruthless control within Whitehall of a process where there was no OBR. So other departments had no idea what was in the budget. Number 10 had very little idea what was in the budget until the night before, if they were lucky. That meant that Gordon Brown, who was a press comms person, part of his brain was obsessed with that. He could then sequence a lot of red herring stories and sequencing the growth stories first before you get to the tax stories. So that became the sort of energy of the budget. And I suspect what's happening now, I've never been in the Treasury for an OBR budget, but once the OBR finally seems to have got the documents and is now doing the forecasting, there's this sort of period when everyone's twiddling their thumbs. I suspect what they're doing now is planning a sequence of hints and briefings to the press in advance of next week. And that's quite important. And it will, of course, raise all the questions about why they're announcing it rather than doing it to Parliament and all that stuff. But I suspect what we'll get is a sequence of announcements and, laying trails on things in the next few days.
Well, certainly what we've had over the last several years.
Well,
where there was one budget recently where everything was
That's right.
was known beforehand. Rather different to the good old days, which I think even older than we were when the budget secrecy was taking really seriously. But what an extraordinary. Stuart's description of how things used to work is exactly right. Things changing right up till less than 24 hours before the budget was produced, and therefore actually part of that process resulted in mistakes. Budgets continually actually have mistakes in them, have announcements that chancellors come to regret, end up undoing. You can think of pretty much everything from capital gains tax and the introduction of the 10p starting rate of income tax, early reforms of the last Labour government. They abolished both of those reforms later on and got into terrible trouble when they did so, because the original reforms were mistakes. Actually, the winter fuel allowance, the last Labour government, this Labour government's got rid of, done in a budget as a way of sort of giving something to everybody.
Autumn statement.
There may well have been an autumn statement, which was pretty much two budgets every year that we had then. And I think one of the things Rachel Reeves needs to be very careful about this time is she doesn't do things which look nice now, but which will actually end up losing a lot of political capital undoing later on, because they turn out to be too expensive or have the wrong kinds of incentive effects relative to what she was expecting. And I think that's a real risk with budgets. So our expectation is going to be a big budget. Now, lots of budgets are big in the sense they've got lots and lots of announcements in them. It's a mad way of making policy, really, to have this one announcement where you squidge as much as possible stuff in it as you can. You try and give something to everybody, and it's not surprising that you end up with errors along the line.
It's a mad way to set tax bill. I'm listening to the tweaking at 3 a.m. does sound a little bit horrified. I'm frankly horrified that people are tweaking 2 weeks before the budget, a month before the budget. The idea that you're setting long-term tax policy is going to affect people for decades, generations to come, and you're making those decisions 2 weeks before the budget seems to me crazy. And you're trying to fine-tune things about, have we got enough headroom for this? Can we fit this in? Can we squeeze this in? That's not the way to design a tax policy. It's the way it's done, but it's...
it was even worse than that, because in the Gordon Brown era, the key document wasn't the budget, it was Gordon Brown's speech. And Gordon Brown would write his speech. And what was in the speech set what was in the actual budget documents. And Ed Balls, who was a brilliant articulator, sort of connecting tissue between Gordon Brown and the Treasury, would have sort of, you suddenly get a call, all the officials would go in and say, oh, I'm afraid we scrapped that. And it'd be like 3 days before, because Gordon had decided it didn't fit the speech. And so we'd have to change the budget in response to that. So, it's more precarious even than you think.
And of course, these things really matter to get it consistent over time. The taxation of pension, you'd thought if there's one thing you need to have consistency over time is how your pension is taxed. And it's been changed and fiddled around with virtually every budget for the last goodness knows how long. The last government, corporation tax down, corporation tax up, personal allowances up, personal allowances down, limits on pension contributions down, limits on pension contributions up. It's no way to run a country. It'd be fair. I think it would be fair to say. Well, we've only got a week to wait now. This time next week, Helen and I will be in the office, desperately trying to work out what's just happened and putting together our analysis of the budget, and hoping that we won't have to say that there were a whole bunch of silly things in there on the tax side. and elsewhere. So thank you to our live audience for this edition of the IFS Zooms In. Thank you to Stephen and Stewart and to Helen for being here. Thank you, everyone who's been listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, do visit us at www.ifs.org.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.